Undeclared wars are commonplace. Tragically, our government engages in preemptive war, otherwise known as aggression, with no complaints from the American people. Sadly, we have become accustomed to living with the illegitimate use of force by government. To develop a truly free society, the issue of initiating force must be understood and rejected.
What if sometimes, to love your country, you had to alter or abolish the government? What if Jefferson was right? What if that government is best which governs least? What if it is dangerous to be right when the government is wrong? What if it is better to perish fighting for freedom than to live as a slave? What if freedom's greatest hour of danger is now?
Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Thursday, January 29th, 2026. Colonel Douglas Macgregor joins us now. Colonel, a pleasure. Thank you for accommodating my schedule. I want to spend some time with you, asking you to analyze the status of things between Ukraine and Russia and how much longer this war is likely to last. But before we do, to some breaking news. How close are Israel and the United States to attacking Iran?
I think we're on the precipice of a full-blown war. No question about it.
When you say full-blown war, do you mean an in-and-out attack like President Trump says he favors, or an invasion?
Well, first of all, I don't think we can invade. We don't have the ground forces to do it. We can't even move those forces rapidly to the theater for the purpose. This is a war of ruthless destruction that we are prepared to wage on behalf of Israel against Iran. I think that's very clear. And it's not going to be short if it turns out that what I'm predicting is true, because the Iranians will treat this as total war from their vantage point.
And what will the president tell the American public is the justification for this war, since Hezbollah has eventually been denuded or neutered? We know that Iran hasn't been developing nuclear weapons since 2002 or 2003, and no one can make a serious argument that Iran poses a national security threat to the United States.
Judge, I agree with you. There's no debate about this. Unfortunately, we have to listen very carefully to President Trump, and he has repeated the Israeli talking points consistently. And these talking points have not changed for a very long time. So number one, there can be no uranium enrichment, period. That is effectively demand number one. Demand number two is that Iran has to submit to the dismantlement of its missile arsenal. Essentially no long-range strike weapons whatsoever, certainly nothing that could reach Israel. And then finally, that Iran has to cease and desist from supporting the various Shiite populations across the Middle East. That means not just Hezbollah, but also in the Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. In other words, Iran surrenders unconditionally to Israeli demands. Now, I don't think these demands are meant to be the basis for any negotiated agreement. I think these demands are exactly what I said. It's our way or the highway. And I think President Trump continues to communicate that. So while I agree with everything that you've said, it doesn't matter. These are the demands that he's put forward, and these demands lead to war.
But this is going to manifest the control that the Zionist lobby has over him, because there's no way the American public is going to understand this, particularly if American troops are killed.
Well, I think you're right, except that the American public has slept through most of these conflicts over many, many years, unless it comes home in some dramatic fashion. If we lose not 2 or 3 or 5 or 6, but a few hundred or 1,000 over the period of 2 or 3 days, I doubt seriously that anyone in the electorate will pay a great deal of attention. Now, the other possibility that we cannot dismiss out of hand is fifth column activity, that we will lose people inside our own country to various kinds of acts of terror. That has not happened. The Iranians have not pushed that, but that's a distinct possibility. And then, of course, you have the people that are still on the ground in the Middle East who could be killed.
So the Israelis demand, and that means that Trump will demand, that there be no enrichment of uranium, not even for medical and health purposes.
I don't think so. I think the Israelis are in the driver's seat at this point, and that's what they want. Their view is they are not going to trust to anything the Iranians say or do. And the Iranian view is that they're not going to trust anything we say or do or the Israelis say or do. I don't see how you avoid at that point an obvious armed collision. I think the larger consequences are escaping everybody's attention. We don't know what happens with the Straits of Hormuz. Will they be closed? If they're closed, then oil prices are not simply going to spike. It's going to be dramatic in terms of its impact on our economy and the financial system. What about the rest of the world? What's the rest of the world think of all of this? And I think we're already headed on a road down to two different worlds. On one side, you'll have BRICS, and I think that'll end up having at least 100 members before they're through, with gold-backed or commodity-backed currency. And then you have us on the other side, probably with most of the West Europeans and potentially some people in Latin America, Australia, perhaps, I don't know. And what are we going to use? Our fiat currency is in a lot of trouble. We've debased it. The dollar is at an all-time position of weakness. Certainly, it has not been this weak since 2022. Bottom line is, I think what happens financially and economically will be disastrous.
What does the rest of the Arab world think of, or how will it react? How will Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates react if and when the U.S. attacks Iran?
Well, these countries are not in a position to do a great deal. They are not going to cut their noses off to spite their faces. In other words, they're not going to take actions that could sour relations with us on a permanent basis. They want to survive. They don't have any real military power. The nation state that we all need to watch carefully is Turkey. The Turks have made it very clear that while they may have differences with Iran, and they have over many centuries, that's not a secret, they do not support the destruction of Iran. And we need to get back to this basic proposition. What are we doing against Iran? If we're not going to invade it, and I see no evidence that we will do that, then what is our goal? Previously, it was to decapitate and cause regime change. Is that still a goal? I suspect it probably is. But I think the larger goal is to destroy the country. We've already bankrupted the country. We've destroyed the value of the currency. Now we're going to go in and essentially level the place. What does that mean? That means they've got a water problem. It's going to get a lot worse. A food shortage, massive destruction of infrastructure, not just hopefully of the arsenals of including long-range strike weapons and so forth, but effectively everything and anything that could have any military or political utility inside the country. That's where we're headed. Do we have enough missiles, rockets, munitions on hand to do that? I don't know.
You want to bet me as to whether or not Trump gets a declaration of war from Congress or just does this on its own? Will you take that bet?
Judge, listen, I think we live in a post-constitutional world. It's sad, but that's the way it is. And the Constitution is something people pay lip service to, but they otherwise ignore it. And that's certainly true on the Hill.
Here's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. And I'll bet you on this, that this does not become a topic of conversation when and if we invade Israel. Why is Israel permitted to have nuclear weapons and Iran isn't?
Well, they're unique and special. You have to understand that. Obviously, you have not been paying attention to the president or numerous governors. As somebody like Governor DeSantis, who's flown to Florida to sign a specific executive order creating a special class of human beings called Jews that cannot be criticized in any way, shape, or form. And now we have a a rabbi running an office in the State Department who is setting out to teach the world that Jews are good and to correct anything in the record that could be remotely anti-Semitic. I mean, this is something we haven't seen since Lenin took over in the Soviet Union. One of the first things he did was effectively the same thing: outlaw any mention of the elders of Zion, any manifestation of anti-Semitism, and on pain of ending up in the gulag in some sort of slave labor camp. We haven't gotten to the slave labor camps, but we certainly have created a system where it's not a question of do you like or dislike Jewish people. The question is whether or not they like you. And if they don't like you, then I guess potentially you go to jail.
And then there's this, cut number 10.
We made a change to designate the use of the term Zionist as a proxy for a protected attribute as hate speech. So if somebody were to use Zionist, of course you can use it in the sense of you're a proud Zionist, but if you're using it in the context of degrading somebody, calling somebody a Zionist as a dirty name, then that gets designated as hate speech to be moderated against. Over the course of 2024, we tripled the amount of accounts that we were banning for hateful activity. We also have, I think, over 24 Jewish organizations that are constantly feeding us intelligence and information when they spot violative trends. There is no finish line. There's no finish line to moderating hate speech, identifying hateful trends, trying to keep the platform safe. There's no such thing as an end game.
This is what TikTok has become since the president engineered it into the tender hands of his friend Larry Ellison.
Well, imagine in the past that we actually did distinguish between Nazis and Germans. We always distinguished communists from Russians or Poles or Czechs or so forth. In other words, we tried to avoid hating in the plural.
Right.
What we've done now is turn that on its head. And we're going to end up with a big problem involving hatred of people in the plural. You know, the worst part of this is that this is not going to defeat, suppress, or eliminate anti-Semitism. This is going to make matters worse. And I think you can make a good argument that our behavior in the Middle East, certainly since 2003, has made matters worse in terms of anti-Semitism for Israel. But I don't see these approaches as helping very much. The thing is, we have, I think today, 6 media companies or corporations. And 30 years ago, there were roughly 50. No one seems to be interested in breaking up those monopolies, which is really what is necessary. Just as we need to break up the 5 big defense industries that you were consolidated for various reasons, and you have to understand the context at the time. But nevertheless, nobody raises their voice against any of this. Nobody says Microsoft is too big or Amazon is too big and these should be broken up. It's a strange world we're living in, but I think it reflects the enormous power and influence of the billionaires over policymaking, Judge.
Well, these billionaires who hired this fellow, Adam Presser, who's the CEO of TikTok, are not interested in a business model. They're interested in an ideological model because the young people are apparently leaving TikTok in droves. Colonel President Trump says he's assembling an armada in the Middle East. Do you know what he means by that? I know, Judge, don't ask me to get into the president's brain, but do you know what this is and where it would be?
Well, given that you have carrier battle groups are the centerpiece of our so-called armadas, whether it's in the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, or the Indian Ocean, and you're asking where will these carrier battle groups be, I think they're going to stay, hopefully, beyond the range of Iranian missile strikes, or at least they'll be masked by intervening terrain, mountains, or protected in other ways. Because a lot of people are now saying that there'll be an enormous amount of effort devoted to attacking carriers. Perhaps. I think we overestimate the impact of a carrier air group on activities like this. Most of the heavy ordnance is not delivered by jets flying off of carriers. It's delivered by the Air Force. and from ships that launch missiles. But I think there's an obsession with that. At any rate, there are a lot of people that are expecting attacks on carriers. We'll see. It's very difficult to hit a carrier at great range out in the middle of the ocean. But the point is this: we have assembled all that we have on hand in terms of missiles and munitions and platforms. When I say that we can concentrate in a relatively short period of time. Do we have more? Yes. Are they in a high state of readiness? Doubtful. And the real issue at this point, or the real question, if I were in the president's position, that I would ask is, how long can we fight? In other words, how long can we launch missiles before we run out? And history suggests that we will run out before the Iranians do. And that's a problem.
Colonel, switching gears, how much longer will the Russians fight? I mean, stated differently, how much longer can the Ukrainian military last?
I don't think it's a question of the Ukrainian military lasting so much, because they're down to perhaps 250,000 or less. And are they putting up some resistance? Of course. The Russians have not aggressively advanced, because I think President Putin.
If I could just stop you for a second, this is Al Jalani, the former head chopper who's now recognized as the president of Syria, arriving at the presidential offices of President Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin.
Right. Well, Jalani, soon to be a Rhodes Scholar, I guess, is the instrument of not just us and Israel, but also Mr. Erdogan. He's most dependent upon Mr. Erdogan. Mr. Erdogan will bend over backwards to court the Russians. And I think Erdogan has urged him to go to Moscow and to hammer out some sort of arrangement with Putin. Putin maintains a small presence on the Syrian coast, and I think they're going to settle that. And I think Putin is probably going to urge him to exercise restraint regarding the mass murder of Christians, Shiites, Armenians, and so forth. The point is that right now he is in a very difficult position because he's caught between the Israelis and Erdogan. Erdogan wants very much for him to control Syria, and Erdogan wants to control Syria. But the Israelis are in the south, and they continue to poke their finger in the face of Erdogan. So this is all very complex, but it's an effort to avoid conflict, and I think that's really what the meeting is all about.
Back to the likely duration, given the imbalance in strength of Russia versus Ukraine.
Well, the problem is, and I don't know how many missiles per ship or how many missiles have been allocated for aircraft and aboard the carriers. But the point is, most of these vessels have to return to port to reload. You can go through your air defense missiles very, very quickly. If you're dodging incoming Iranian missiles, you're inclined to fire 2, maybe 3 missiles at a time, because if one gets through and strikes a vessel at sea, you're in a lot of trouble. Same thing is true on land. This was the issue the last time in June of last year. They were running out of air defense missiles, and that's when President Trump intervened. But I think now we're in a different kind of situation. This is a no-holds barred for Iran. Iran is not going to exercise restraint. Iran is going to launch everything it's got. And I don't know how much the Israelis have to launch. I'm sure they will and we will. But at some point, it will stop. And then the question is, has Iran capitulated? That's really what people want the Iranians to do. They want them to scream that they can't take any more. I don't think that's going to happen. You know, there's an old expression from the Royal Navy from the last century, or I guess the 19th century now, ship's a fool to fight a fort. You know, Iran has almost limitless assets compared to what we have at sea, and almost limitless compared to what Israel has got to throw at us. So the danger then emerges: does someone, especially Israel, turn to the use of a nuclear weapon? That's my greatest concern, always has been, because if that happens, then any assumptions we've made about who steps up next and what happens around the world are all irrelevant. It's a new world at that point.
Back to Ukraine and Russia.
Well, Ukraine is going to do what it does, and that means that Zelensky is going to stay there until he's removed, either by his own people or the Russians. We have decided that we're going to turn it over to the Europeans. The European leaders at this point have decided to keep going no matter what. So the question is really one for Moscow. Moscow holds the initiative. Moscow has, as President Trump would say, all the cards. They can move forward. Will they? I'm surprised that they haven't already taken steps to cross the river and get control of Odessa. I think that will eventually happen. They're certainly going to control Kharkiv, which is historically Kharkov. Then the real question is, what do you do about Kiev? Because the Russians don't want to inflict any damage there. Kiev is practically a holy city in Russia, but they've got to get rid of this regime. There can be no peace as long as Zelensky and his friends are in power. I don't know what the true state of affairs is inside Ukraine, but the feedback I'm getting from people I know who are over there on the ground is that everyone is very, very fed up with Zelensky and his government. Does that translate into action to overthrow it? I don't know.
Are these negotiations going to go anywhere? I mean, Zelensky keeps saying we're not going to give away any land. That statement must be made for domestic political consumption, because if the Russians thought he was serious, then they'd be wasting their time talking to him.
Well, President Trump is in charge on the Western side. This is the thing that people don't understand. President Trump postures as a tough guy, as the man in charge. But the Europeans certainly haven't behaved in any way to suggest that they regard him as the man in charge. They've ignored him largely when it comes to Ukraine. He can intervene and stop this. What he can do is a few things very, very straightforwardly. First of all, you pull the plug on the money and the equipment from the United States, just say, that's it, you've had your shot, we're not going to support you anymore. And then he tells the Europeans, I don't want you to support them. If you support them, then you're going to pay a price, because we're not going to stay here and continue to defend you in perpetuity. Finally, he has always had the power to basically turn to the intelligence organizations and say, Zelensky needs to go away. Somebody pick him up and take him out of the country. This is what I think the Russians have been waiting for. The Russians have never completely grasped that President Trump, contrary to his public persona, is actually too nice. He's unwilling to take the harsh action that is required to end this war. And that means he's got to remove this government in Kiev. If he does that, then it's over. It's that simple. Somebody else can be brought in. It can't be Zaluzhny, who is a creature of MI6, but there are others out there that can take over the government. They could even hold interim elections. That's something that could be done in some fashion. But the bottom line is that there could be no negotiated settlement until certain basic things are acknowledged. One is neutrality. Two is the loss of certain territories right now. And then finally, the understanding that there can never be any foreign troops of any kind on the ground in that country whose aims are hostile to Russia. Now, this is not neurosurgery. President Trump, I think, wants a quote unquote win. He could get a real win if he determined to impose those conditions on Ukraine to end this war. But he's thus far been unwilling to do so.
I guess your theory about, it's more than a theory, it's a historical fact, the reverence that Slavic peoples have for Kyiv might explain why the Russians have done their best to cut off water, heat, and electricity. They want the public to leave. They don't want to bomb them out. They just want them to go.
Well, yeah, they want them to get out of the way. There's no question about that. But they don't want the public to be permanently expelled. We're not talking about an ethnic cleansing, and we're not talking about replacing the Ukrainians with Russians. That's not the goal.
Right.
He's always been about the Russians inside Ukraine. That's the bottom line. That's been the justification for the intervention. If he was about what you just described and removing Ukrainians, he'd already be on the western side of the river. That's not something he wants, just as he doesn't want a war with the Europeans, doesn't want a war with us.
What is he going to do with his Oreshniks?
He's got a lot of pressure on him right now. There are a
Yes.
lot of people in his inner circle that would like to blast the living daylights out of us and the Europeans.
What is he going to do with his Oreshniks? Just keep them in reserve, or can he end this in a couple of weeks with a few Oreshniks?
No, I don't think he can do that. I think he could use them selectively for specific targets. They've been very effective, destroying logistical infrastructure, intelligence collection, and so forth. But he wants a government in Ukraine that he can talk to, that will negotiate with him. That's the key. He's not interested in a puppet regime that will be controlled completely from Moscow. He's willing to accept Ukrainian independence. The conditions are very clear.
Right. Do you think that there's a lot of pressure on him in his inner circle to get very aggressive militarily?
There has always been enormous pressure on him from that standpoint. He is by training and a lawyer in most cases. He's very legally minded, Judge. Listen to his comments on international law. Listen to his discussion of what he thinks is right or wrong in connection with us in the Caribbean, or what the Ukrainians have done, or what's happening today in the Middle East. This is someone who is by nature cautious and deliberate. The Russians are angry. Their view is it's time to set all that aside and just club these people to death like baby seals. He doesn't want to do that. So when I hear people talk about regime change in Russia, I shudder to think what that could mean for us in the West.
Last question. Are the Russians going to supply any assistance? I guess I should expand this. Are the Russians or the Chinese going to supply any assistance to Iran, military assistance?
They already have. The Chinese, as you know, have delivered hundreds of missiles. They've delivered a lot of technicians that have come with them and will operate equipment. There are even some Chinese pilots on the ground helping with aircraft. The Russians have sent in technical personnel to assist with radars and integrated air defenses. The last time around, surprisingly, the Iranians insisted to the Russians they wanted to defend themselves and not be dependent on Russia and do it themselves. And a lot of people didn't notice this, but when Pashkinian, the president, arrived in Moscow to speak to Putin after the 12-day conflict, something was said by the president of Iran, and President Putin responded by saying in Russian, "You should have let us help you." I think now they've had the help, and I think they are much, much better prepared for what is coming than they were before. Now, that doesn't mean that they can withstand it all easily. The Iranians have never been concerned about coping with the Israelis. They're concerned about coping with us. And if you put us together with the Israelis, that seems like an almost insurmountable obstacle to them. So they are fatalistic. They will do everything in their power to preserve themselves and defeat their enemies. But they know that they're up against something very, very dangerous and very powerful in the form of the U.S. Armed Forces. No question about it.
Is there any way that the negotiations in Abu Dhabi are going to resolve the special military operation, or is it destined to be resolved when the Zelensky regime leaves or collapses and the military can fight no longer?
I think the latter is true, what you said at the end, because right now there isn't a willingness to believe us. Our credibility, our legitimacy is very much in question today in the world, as you know, Judge. We've lied to the Russians on several occasions, so have the Europeans. This goes all the way back to the Minsk agreements. The Russians went into that, in retrospect, foolishly believing that it was serious when it never was. And the other problem that both the Iranians, the Russians, and everybody else has is, let's say we come to some sort of agreement or arrangement. What certainty is there that the next administration, the next president who steps into office is going to abide by any of it? In other words, we're completely unreliable as an international strategic partner.
Colonel Macgregor, thank you very much, my dear friend. We may be spending a lot of time together if the U.S. and you're available, if the U.S. and Israel attack Iran. But thank you for all of this analysis. Very, very profound, frightening, but profound.
Okay, thank you, Judge.
All the best, my dear friend. It's very sad what America is coming to, but we'll be here to cover it for you from a perspective that you don't get on the mainstream media. You all know that. Coming up later today at 2 o'clock, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. At 3 o'clock, Professor John Mearsheimer. At 4 o'clock, we think he's still in Italy, but we're not sure. Pepe Escobar, Judge Napolitano for Judging Freedom.